They make a big fuss about the fact that they're creating an Office of Religious Freedom in the Department of Foreign Affairs. And in Canadian prisons, they say, well, sorry, you have to make do with whatever's on offer, and, you know, it's all spiritual, so that's fine.
That's interim Liberal leader Bob Rae reacting today to the controversial move to scale back on the number of chaplains in federal prisons. The cost-cutting move chops part-time spiritual advisors, and most of them are non-Christian. Let's take a look at the current religious makeup of the federal inmate population in our hot sheet. About 50% are Christian. Another 4.5% are Muslim, 4% follow First Nations spirituality, and 2% or less are Buddhist, Jewish, or Sikh. So, does this move trample on the rights of religious minorities behind bars? How will it affect the rehabilitation of inmates, and will it face a legal challenge on constitutional grounds? Joining me now, Candice Bergen, the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Public Safety. Thanks for joining us. NDP Foreign Affairs critic Paul Dewar, as well as Liberal Justice critic Irwin Cotler. Thanks for joining us today on this issue. Now, Ms. Bergen, I want to start with you. Take us behind the scenes of this decision-making process and why the government is cutting all non-Christian chaplains.
First of all, let me clarify. There was a mistake actually in the article as it was written. I believe it was the CBC that wrote it. We are not cutting Christian contracts. We are cutting part-time contracts, and I'd be happy to give you the background on it. Under the current system,
it works out too.
Well, let me just explain. So, under the current system, there's a formula that determines what specific religion will have an actual spiritual leader there, either a pastor, a rabbi, whatever the religion is, that is determined by a formula within each facility, depending on what is the majority of the religion that is represented. So, for example, there were some full-time religious providers of services of a specific religion. There were part-time of a different religion, and then there were many religions that had no services provided at all. So what we decided to do was cut all of the part-time and have one full-time spiritual advisor. So what we are wanting to see is we want to see chaplains, as they're called, but really they can be of any religion. We want to see chaplains who are hired, who will provide spiritual service on a request basis by the inmates. We also want to see, there are 2,500 volunteers right now that come and volunteer in federal penitentiaries. We really want to see that facilitated and encouraged, because we believe strongly in Canadians having freedom of religion. We believe inmates should have freedom of religion
as well. Now, to go to your numbers, these are from your department, 80 full-time chaplains across the country, all but one are Christian.
That was under the previous formula. That's right. And there was a specific formula that determined which were full-time and which were part-time. And as I said, so there were some religions that had no representation at all. I think that's actually not fair. So I would say the taxpayers' dollars should rather go to funding a non-specific religious spiritual advisor. So an individual who will come in, they might have their own personal faith, but I think that it's realistic, whether you're a counselor or whatever you're doing, you can have your own specific religious faith and still be able to provide spiritual advice to all of the inmates. And then we welcome all faiths to come and to provide volunteer services.
Help me understand here. Inmates. Of 80 full-time chaplains across the country, they're all but one are Christian. So will some of those
contracts are coming up?
Oh, so their contracts are coming up, yes. And then you're hiring non-denomination?
Well, what we are instructing, and what we want to see, what we want CBS or Correctional Service Canada to do, and I think that it's fair to say, let's watch and make sure that this is working the way we want it to be working. We want these chaplains to come in. We want them to provide certainly services in their own specific religion that they are ministers of, but then we want them to also be available to offer services, counseling.
Is that realistic?
And well, we think it is. We recognize, I guess the alternative is, as we've been doing, and we don't think it's fair. There are some religions that get a full-time minister, pastor, or rabbi. There are some that get a part-time. There are some religions in the penitentiaries that have no representation.
And just quickly, when are their contracts up? So that
I believe it's coming up fairly quickly in the next couple of months, I believe.
Now, Mr. Dewar, when you hear this, is that acceptable?
Well, when I hear it, it's more confusing because the government was saying something certainly different in the House today. We've had an update from Parliamentary Secretary just now, so it's a real head-scratcher as to what is their policy. One thing I can say, if I may, so we're just trying to find out what is the policy. What we're hearing is that the service that was provided before by part-time support is no longer going to be there. And I'm not sure that's a smart thing to do, and here's why. You know, as was already mentioned by the Parliamentary Secretary, that there are, you know, different numbers in different institutions. And we think probably it makes sense to have it, you know, those services met to the population, as was suggested by the government, but to do that in a way that is nimble. And the way to do that would be part-time contracts. The part that concerns me is the message that seems to be sent out from government is that, you know, when we have Minister Baird talking about promoting religious freedom as a tenet and cornerstone of the government on foreign affairs, they seem to be regressing on that when it comes to domestic affairs. And I think that's contradictory, and I think that's unfortunate.
Mr. Cotler, when you hear the update from the Parliamentary Secretary, does that scenario work for you?
No, I mean, Ms. Bergen is correct on the fact that these are part-time chaplains, but that's the point. It's that the non-Christian chaplains are represented amongst the part-time chaplains. So when you terminate their contracts, the bottom line is that's when you end up denying freedom of conscience and religion under the Charter. That's when you end up denying equality before the law. And that's when you prejudice the reintegration and rehabilitation of these prisoners in society, because they don't have equal access to these services. Then you end up undermining their reintegration.
I think we're mixing apples and oranges, and I think if, you know, first of all, obviously in question period when a person has 35 seconds, I appreciate this opportunity to have a discussion, and I think that we are mixing apples with oranges when in terms of we're not denying anyone freedom to their religion, to practice their religion. You know, we're talking specifically, obviously, about inmates. We're not denying them at all, but what we have seen, as I explained, we were funding certain religious leaders on a full-time basis, some on a part-time, some had no representation at all. We don't think that's fair. So what we're rather saying is the contracts are coming up.
They're coming up in March, by the way.
Thank you. March.
That makes sense at the end of the fiscal year.
Right. So what we're going to be doing is hiring and being very specific. And I think it's fair to let's hold their feet to the fire.
How are you going to do that to ensure they have equal representation in the prisons?
Well, equal representation, again, that's when we're talking about hiring these chaplains or spiritual leaders, that would obviously be part of CSC's operational human resources management. When they're hiring someone, are you going to be comfortable if you are of this faith? Will you be able to counsel and help someone of a different faith? But then if they actually want to have services in their own specific faith, we encourage these 2,500 volunteers to bring services in, as they already are doing. But it's the funding of the part-time, the full-time, and then some not getting any funding at all.
But if they're not,
I think that's fairly reasonable. I think it's fairly reasonable to say we're not going to keep funding some faiths and not others. We'd rather just make sure it's fair for everyone, but give everyone the freedom to practice their faith.
I'm just wondering, you're saying to fund some and not others. That's, I guess, the problem we certainly have is that when you're, you know, kind of putting out this message on a foreign affairs file, as I said, you know, it's about investing more in terms of expression of religion, religious freedom. And, you know, here at home, this is a cost-saving measure. Let's be frank about that. I don't think the government's going to dispute that. That we need to, you know, be consistent here. And I think what you can tell from the government's explaining today, they're not really going to have a plan that's very clear yet. Hopefully they'll get it together. But, you know, I'd like to know who they're consulting here, because I think it's extremely important to be consulting faith leaders on this, particularly those who are working in prison. I'm just wondering if there's been consultation.
Well, first of all, I think it is very clear. I think the explanation and what we're doing is very clear in terms of part-time, full-time, and eliminating that.
So just to clarify, currently there's 80 full-time chaplains. You'll still have 80 full-time positions across the country, and it's the 100 part-time. So you're eliminating the part-time positions.
Correct.
Will there be any freelance opportunity in there? So hypothetically, in one of these prisons, there's someone who's feeling they're not being represented. Could they have someone brought in and paid for?
Not paid for by the taxpayers' dollars, no. Certainly come in as volunteers and certainly practice.
But has there been consultation with faith leaders about this decision? It's a fairly significant decision.
Has there, or will there be?
We consult on a continuous basis. I was out actually all summer. I know the minister was out consulting on a variety of issues. So we certainly do consult, and we look forward to their input. We recognize the value of these faith groups that come in on a volunteer basis, and we want to encourage that. And certainly we recognize the contribution that they're making. They're giving of their time. They obviously believe very strongly in each one of their particular faiths, and they are bringing that to the inmates. And I think actually, ironically, I was actually a chapel volunteer many, many years ago at a federal penitentiary. And I think that if you've ever gone into a federal penitentiary and you work with inmates, whatever their faith is, they're looking for that interaction. They're looking to have people come in from the community, people who believe the same way they do. I think Mr. Cotler would agree, whatever your faith is, if you can talk to people who believe the same way you do, who can share your faith, and that's really done so well by volunteers, as opposed to the taxpayers saying, well, we'll fund this one full-time and that one part-time, and the rest of you don't get anything.
But consult, I think the answer is no. They didn't consult on this specific.
We have consulted on a variety.
That's a classic answer from government. Is we consult all the time, but on this specific proposition, did you consult, and who did you consult? And I gather we didn't consult anyone.
Well, we do consult all the time,
but not on this specific proposition.
Paul, I don't think right now. It's necessarily, it wouldn't really matter who I said we consulted with. Paul would say,
no,
but you didn't consult with.
And what I'm saying, Paul, is
we do consult constantly.
Yes. On this you did.
We consult all the time.
No,
yes.
Okay, I'll leave people to understand that answer, but I sure don't. It sounds like they didn't.
Mr. Cotler, you wanted to get in?
There have already been expressions of concern by religious leaders from the Muslim faith, from the Jewish faith, from the Sikh community. So obviously, these faith communities have expressed their concern. The fact that the contracts that are being terminated are those of the part-time chaplains only, where these faiths are represented only amongst the part-time chaplains, suggests that somehow, if they were not being targeted by intention, I want to suggest they have not been, but in consequence of this government's decision, they end up being deprived of equal access. Candice is correct that prison inmates can still exercise their freedom of religion and belief. Mm-hmm. What they will not have is equal access with respect to prison services to a chaplain of their choice, not of the government's choice. And that's the important point here.
But under the current system, there were other religious faiths that had no representation at all, none at all. And I think it's unrealistic to think that the government can provide, according to that logic, if one individual inmate is of one particular faith different than the entire rest of the population, under Irwin's logic, the taxpayer should pay for that person to have a religious leader.
Get a volunteer in there?
Oh, well, that's another challenge, and I think that that's certainly something that we have to look at. But I don't think that and the premise that we're laying the foundation is what we're doing. We're laying the foundation so that there's true equality, so that taxpayers' dollars is not going to be going to fund one particular religion first, then another one second, and then the rest of you are just kind of out of luck.
What's the cost savings?
And I think that, Irwin, I think I'm correct. If following your logic through, it would mean that there would be, you would say if someone has one particular religion, even if it's only one person, they should have their religious leader
represented.
My
logic is you just shouldn't have done this because
no, but you're not answering the question, though, Irwin.
Discrimination in
no,
effect,
it's
if
not.
It's
actually
in intent. And I've looked at the breakdown with regard to religions. You've got 57% who are Christians, then you've got 4% Muslims, you've got 4%, et cetera, et cetera. There was no need to cancel contracts of part-time chaplains of all these faiths who are now represented. That is prejudicial in its impact, and nothing that can be said by the government takes away from the fact, as I say, that it's discriminatory in its effect, if not in its intent.
What's the cost savings by cutting these part-time jobs?
It's, I think, $2 million a year. I personally think, though, for the way I look at it as an individual, someone I think we all have different faiths, I think it's important that the government not pick and choose which faiths it's going to fund on a full-time, part-time, or no basis at all.
But really, that's what they're doing by...
No, we're
right?
not. We're funding one full-time...
So how do you choose who's going to be representing in the prisons?
There would be, as I said, a spiritual leader who would not
But who chooses that position?
It would be a hiring decision made by Human Resources at CSE.
And any consultation with any of the groups? The religious groups?
Well, I'm sure that, yes, CSE and the chaplains themselves, the volunteer groups, obviously work with Correctional Services Canada all the time as they develop their volunteer programs, as they work and schedule when they're coming in, as they need space available. At individual facilities, there's constant discussion. I mean, CSE wants to see inmates rehabilitated, and certainly having their particular faith practiced. And as I said, being able to interact with people of their particular faith is very important.
I want to thank you for coming in and clarifying what the government is doing today. Candice Bergen, Paul Dewar, and Irwin Cotler.